Welcome to Rachel, Melody's, and Steve's presentation on the impacts of colonization on indigenous spiritual practices. We would like you to invite you to our home fire and welcome you, and we hope you enjoy our presentation.
Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm going to be speaking on the influences of Catholicism and Christianity on indigenous spirituality and beliefs. When Euro settlers invaded territories of the indigenous people and introduced a structured form of a controlled environment of spirituality or religion, it ruined the natural environment and the sacred spiritual beliefs of our elders and people and confused them. They made our spiritual beliefs into laws and rituals. So now our people, our elders, treat religion like a ritualistic ceremony, meaning if they do these formal ceremonies, it'll make them go to heaven. There is no overarching indigenous religion, but a vast belief in spiritual practices and values. Traditional beliefs have been shared orally until the written language of colonial intervention. Our people knew ways to go to heaven before Catholicism and Christianity even came around. They practiced in ways that connected the spirit of Mother Earth, the animals, the air, the water, and life, growing together in a spiritual consciousness. Spirituality is foundational to everything, education, and the core of our traditional values. God the Creator guided indigenous people in the spiritual world. The indigenous people knew everything about the Bible. Even though they did not read, the Holy Spirit taught them through dreams and visions. The Euro-Canadians also significantly impacted the indigenous people by placing churches all over prime land that indigenous people inhabited. The land they occupied was sacred and ceremonial. To this day, indoctrination and true Catholicism shows the impact that the practices of structured church had on the spirituality of indigenous peoples. Why do indigenous people still worship the Catholic Church when that was the epitome of assimilation to the indigenous peoples? Because that was the church's deception. The church knew how to deceive people and make them believe lies. People are deceived because they see a priest and believe he is a holy man. He is just a man like any other person, like a brother or a member of society. Just because he wears a robe, it does not classify him to be any holier than anyone. He sins just like anybody else on earth. We are all sinners on this earth, and we are born sinners. The significant difference between religion and spirituality is that religion is a structured form of spirituality that usually has a group following. And spirituality may include individual experiences with or without structured belief systems. The indigenous peoples valued their spirituality, language, and culture. It was who they were. The early origins of residential schools in Canada are found in implementing the mission system in the 1600s. The churches and European settlers assumed that their civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. They interpreted the socio-cultural differences between themselves and indigenous peoples as proof that Canada's first inhabitants were ignorant, savage, and like children, in need of guidance. They felt the need to civilize indigenous peoples. Education, a federal responsibility, became the primary means to this end. Residential schools systematically undermined Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures across Canada and disrupted families for generations, severing the ties through which Indigenous culture is taught and sustained and contributing to a general loss of language and culture. The devastating effects of the residential schools are far-reaching and continue to have a significant impact on Indigenous communities. The residential school system is widely considered a form of genocide because of the purposeful attempt from the government and church to eradicate all aspects of Indigenous culture and worldviews. Many of the world's sacred natural sites are located in territories inhabited by Indigenous animistic people and are characterized by spiritual governance, spiritual agency, and biodiversity. Although the significance of Indigenous sacred natural sites is being recognized by conversationalists as biodiverse refugia, the importance of spiritual governance is not well understood. Through attachment, engagement, and social, cultural, and ritual behavior, Indigenous sacred natural sites reflect the physical, biological, spiritual, and cultural character of everyday lives. The Creator. I sometimes wonder if that was always the framing concept pre-contact, or whether it's a blend of compromise between anthropological theism of Christianity and a natural force kind of reminiscent of 18th and 19th century deism. Currently, along with many non-Christian religious or spiritual traditions, there seems to be greater ease of intersection and resolution between Indigenous spirituality and science, the same as Hinduism, Buddhism, and most non-Western traditions. I think a lot of that comes out of the fact that Western science grew out of the antagonism between the Christian church and the natural sciences. So especially now, if it has a focus on nature, it can be reconciled more easily with science rather than assuming there is some divinity pulling all the strings all the time. Religion, as defined by a group of colleagues who wrote Invitations to World Religions, said, is a cultural system integrating teachings, practices, modes of experience, institutions, and artistic expressions that relate people to what they perceive to be transcendent. Spirituality embodies an interconnectedness and interrelationship with all life. Everyone and everything is equal. This view permeates the entire Indigenous vision of life, land, and the universe. The Catholic Church is still vitally important, and the Church must walk in a different direction, given reconciliation is ongoing with the government and religious beliefs. We are all part of this process of learning about each other's cultures and learning about our Canadian history. There is an extraordinary richness that society needs to hear and adapt to from the Indigenous peoples. We bring so much value, beliefs, and practices to the world. The Indigenous peoples had an interconnectedness with silence and Mother Earth. That is how they connected with in-depth spirituality.
Hello, I'm Steve, and I will talk a little bit more on the impacts of colonization on Indigenous ceremonial practices. And as Rachel has mentioned, the impact of colonization on the Indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Island and their forced assimilation to Catholicism had indeed devastating consequences. Not only were Indigenous people removed from their ancestral lands that we see around us here, and their children ripped from them and brought to residential schools, but they also were unwillingly disconnected from the deep and rich spiritual culture and practices that connected them to the land and centered them on a relationship with the Creator and all beings of life, often referred to in ceremonies as all my relations. This usually included all other beings and forms of life, including what we commonly perceive as inanimate objects such as the sacred pipe, the rattles, feathers, fans, the drums, and they were generally seen to be imbued with the spirit or soul as well. Most also viewed Indigenous spirituality as inseparable from their traditional Indigenous cultures and spirituality and identity, consequently. Indigenous people's spiritual practices and beliefs were interwoven with their everyday lives and therefore holistic in nature, which is in a stark contrast to Catholicism. Rather than submitting to a vengeful God and worshipping on account of a human representative of God, such as a priest in a human-made structure like the church, First Nations people recognized their divine connection to the land and the Creator, and they saw themselves as part of creation rather than a separate entity needing redemption and salvation. And this connection to the land and the spirit world and creation itself resulted in various beautiful First Nations and Métis and Inuit spiritual practices in Canada. They varied widely and consisted of complex social and cultural customs for addressing the sacred and the supernatural. The influence of Christianity through settlers, colonization, and missionaries, as well as government policy, significantly altered life for Indigenous people. In some communities, this resulted in hybridized religious practices, while in others, European religion replaced traditional spirituality, methods, and ceremonies entirely. When the British North American Act was passed in 1867, Canada became a country but remained a colony of the British Empire. The Act provided the basic governmental structures and laws that Canada would govern its people. One section in particular, actually, Section 91, defined the relationship between the government and the Aboriginal people, or the Indigenous people. And it echoes of which continues to determine the connection to this day. Section 91 provided the Parliament of Canada with the exclusive legislative authority of Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. The Act marked the end of the nation-to-nation relationship and set the stage for the Indian Act of 1876, which ushered in the era of colonization and enforced cultural assimilation. Actual assimilation could only be attained through the abolishment by law of cultural practices. Hence, under the Indian Act, the potlatch law, which also included other ceremonies such as the Sundance, came into effect in 1880 and made the exercise of these practices a criminal offense, and the law stated that every Indian or another person who engages in or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the potlatch or the Indian dance known as the Tahamawas is guilty of misdemeanor. And you can only imagine, but as a result, ceremonies such as the potlatch, Sundance, sweat lodge, shake tents, and many more, they went underground or altogether disappeared. And this resulted in a significant loss of knowledge, traditional values, and ultimately the identity of the First Nations people. Today, some of the elders who went to residential schools will not speak about spirituality or their traditional practices because it was instilled into them that practicing their traditional ways was the work of the devil and inherently evil. And if they do so in secret, or they're not identifying as having any religious or spiritual significance. And as a result, many Indigenous children grew up and continue to do so without any connection to the old teachings, tradition, and ceremonial practices. And just on a personal note, like at Sundance, we have a ceremony that's part of the Sundance, and it's called the Children's Dance. And during that time, only the children are allowed to dance in the arbor, and the children doctor people, and all the adults have to stand still and just observe and give gratitude. And we do this exactly for this reason, because a lot of time children were not part of the ceremonies when they went on the ground because the adults were fearing of the children speaking to the Indian agent, because we all know children are so honest and open and they just want to share. So children were robbed of so much due to this act. And it was not until 1951 that the ban on ceremonies ended and traditional ceremonies start to be practiced again. Over time, there undoubtedly has been a revival of those ceremonies, and many Indigenous people attend them again in hopes of finding healing from the impacts of colonization. as the significance of those ceremonial practices remain faithful to the sacred teachings that go back to the beginning of time. Once forbidden, ancient ceremonies now lead the way for many out of the intergenerational trauma into a path of rediscovery of inherited knowledge stored deep within the participants' blood memory. Indigenous gatherings and ceremonies, they existed for thousands of years before European contact. And understanding the history of injustice that Indigenous people have survived and endured makes the fact that ceremonies still exist and that Indigenous people still practice their tradition an act of resistance and resilience. And it gives hope for the future generations born into the many diverse Indigenous cultures all across Turtle Island.
Hi, I'm Melody Elliott, and I will be speaking about the impacts of colonization on Indigenous ethnobotany. Knowledge and practices of Indigenous people relating to local plants, use of food, medicine, materials, and other purposes are threatened globally. The reasons for declining knowledge and use of traditional resources are complex and multifaceted. There are many reasons for the loss of knowledge and practices, which include compounding influence of changing knowledge systems owing to religious conversion and residential schools, loss of Indigenous language, loss of time and of opportunity for traditional practice owing to participation in the wage economy, increased urbanization of Indigenous populations, loss of access to traditional resources, restrictions of management practices for sustaining these resources, and most recently, forces of globalization and industrialization. Efforts to renew and restore traditional practices and relationships with plants, environments must be recognize the cumulative effects of these factors. We need to find ways to retain and reinforce the knowledge and practices still held by individuals and communities to reverse some of the negative influences on cultural retention and develop new, relevant, and effective ways to revitalize language, cultures, ethnobotanical knowledge within contemporary context. Ancestral plant relationships exist around the world and have shaped and defined cultural relationships. Plants teach us about our identity and ground our perceptions of health and wellness. They demonstrate resilience, adaptability, and reveal who we are as humans. The study of ethnobotany is a path to explore interpersonal relationships among plants, people, culture, and the land. In response, respectful and reciprocal ways, community-based research and practices offer an opportunity to build relationships with plants, the people connected to the plants. Indigenous people hold significant accumulative knowledge that has enabled them to live in one place using the resources of their homelands for countless generations. In the past, sharing knowledge has led to some profound injustices for Indigenous people. For example, medicines and foods have been commercialized, patented without permission, compensation, or recognition of the source. At the time, Indigenous people have been forcefully, often violently stripped of their traditional cultivation and harvesting grounds and knowledge linked to such cultural essential places. Indigenous people worldwide have suffered many injustices and discriminatory actions from dominant societies and governments on a broader scale, which has caused a loss of traditional knowledge of plants and their usage. The medicinal knowledge of Indigenous people of the Western Canadian boreal forest has been given considerably less attention. A total of 546 medicinal plants used by Indigenous people of the Canadian boreal forest have been reported. Canada lacks a comprehensive policy on harvesting, conservatory, and medicinal plants. We are all responsible for giving back to the land and supporting the necessary change to uphold healthy ecosystems for future generations. A Applying Indigenous practices and knowledge can develop and redefine how we conduct research, community engagement, and how we conduct ourselves. Indigenous people, ecological knowledge and their traditional ways should be at the forefront of any research interest, particularly biocultural diversity, important in sustaining the Earth's ecosystem. There is no question that the Earth's ecosystem are deteriorating rapidly due to human impact. Human activities have taken the planet to the edge of a massive wave of species extinctions, further threatening our own well-being. These injustices require work and commitment to recognize the role of colonization and the ongoing impacts of systematic racism have had on Indigenous people and to ensure it will never happen again. It is all our responsibility to come to the acknowledgement that change needs to be required with stepping forward with an open mind and open heart. That following traditional knowledge and practices when dealing with plants and medicines do not need to be hidden away in fear, but to be shared with knowledge before the knowledge is lost. Specifically, critical issues need to be addressed regarding legal, ethical, and cultural aspects of conserving medicinal plant species and protecting the associated traditional knowledge. Allowing for a policy framework to safeguard medicinal plant use and traditional knowledge will also help science and those who need a blending of Western scientific practices and traditional methods. Building a database with such information and knowledge will help heal and cultivate better practices that will help many generations to come. Indigenous people will probably be more open to sharing their knowledge if they had more power in land of governance, that the development of sustaining harvest practices, encouraging micro-enterprise development by Indigenous and rural communities, and protection of the traditional ways. We, as a collective, need to break down the ongoing issue of racism, the effects of colonization, so that we can come to the table with a fair, unbiased sharing of knowledge and practices.